Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you very much for attending this lecture. My name is Sebastien Peyrouse. I'm a research professor working on Central Asia with the Central Asia program at the Institute for European, Russian and Eurasian Studies at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., in the United States. And so today I'm going to talk about religions in Central Asia. Why? Because first, religion is an important part of history and culture of Central Asia. Religions play a significant role in the lives of and in the identity of Central Asian people. Why? But if you look at the figures of the population in Central Asia, I mean, Central Asia counts about 60 million people, the majority of whom considers themselves Muslim. About 70% of Kazakhstani population considers themselves as Muslim. More than 80% Kyrgyzstan, and more than 90% in other Central Asian countries, so Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. Besides, you have a significant Christian minorities living in these countries, with about 25% in Kazakhstan, about 17% in Kyrgyzstan, but less in the other country. I mean, less than 10% in the three other countries. And you also have some Jewish communities who still live in the region. On the other hand, only about 4% of people consider themselves as non-religious in Kazakhstan, and even less, about 1.5% in Tajikistan, and less than 1% in Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan consider themselves as non-religious. And I would say that such figures are kind of striking after the Soviet regime, which conducted a strong anti-religious policy. And second, religion is important because it has been one of the tools used by the political authorities to assert their legitimacy. After the independence of Central Asian countries, so after 1991, the presidents and the governments of Central Asian countries have asserted that they brought religious freedom, a kind of religious renaissance in their country, and that they were guarantee also a protection of the population against what they deemed as uncontrolled trends of religion, and especially of Islam, and including violent or extremist movements. And when it comes to religions, Central Asia history, and even more generally that of the former Soviet Union, is traditionally divided into three temporal units. The first one, the long period of history until the Soviet regime, would have contributed to the development of religion, of Islam, of Christianity, and of other religions. The second one, the Soviet regime, would have conducted a very strong anti-religious policy with almost a systematic prohibition of religions and systematic pressure on believers. And the practice of religion during all the Soviet regime would have been very strictly, extremely limited. The third one, and the third period from 1991, the new states, the new independent states of Central Asia would have allowed, according to the governments of Central Asia and to some observers, the revival of religions which were formerly granted before the Soviet regime. And I think it's important to somewhat challenge this division to understand the history and evolution of religions in Central Asia. Since ancient times, Central Asia has been a land of religious diversity, but with periods which were much less tolerant to this diversity and which even led to the disappearance of some religions. Then the Soviet period combined, it is true, phases of a strong repression and phases of cohabitation. Why? Because the Soviet regime had at some point to find some compromise with a religious phenomenon that it did not master. So what I would like to explain in this lecture is that the so-called religious revival is not a plain resurgence of religion, supposedly almost completely suppressed by the atheistic Soviet regime and restored by democratic post-independence governments, but rather a diversification of approaches and practices of religion which have been materialized by Central Asian populations increasing religiosity at the crossroads of domestic cultural and historical legacies of current political, economic, and social tribal context, and also of transnational human and technological flows. And I will also highlight the impact of globalization on religious phenomena in Central Asia, where traditional and sometimes forcibly beliefs and practices coexist with increasing globalized beliefs and also in a limited way with processes of politicization of religion, and in the case of Central Asia, especially of Islam. And I will show that the new states of Central Asia are far from recognizing the right of individuals to practice any religion, all religions, and the diversity, especially of approaches that each religion can have, and in particular in Islam. And the current political authorities' control of religion has led, actually, in some cases, to a reduction of religious freedom, which sometimes is more drastic than during the post-Stalinist Soviet regime, which some believers now in contemporary Central Asia have interpreted as an assault against religion and especially against Islam. So I will divide this presentation into 4 parts, with the first part which will be focused on the religious diversity until the Soviet regime. Then it will be followed by an introduction on the handling of religion under the Soviet regime, which I think is essential to understand contemporary Central Asian population's approach to religion. In the third part, I will talk about the evolution of religion in Central Asia after independence, and I will address the growing religiosity in all the region. And the fourth and final part will address the extent and limits of the politicization of Islam in Central Asia, where a so-called violent extremist threat has been used by the political authorities to strictly regulate and repress manifestation of most forms, actually, of alternative approaches to religion deemed not to conform to the framework authorized by political authorities. So Central Asia has enjoyed a religious diversity from earliest antiquity. I mean, this has, for example, included shamanist practices, but also Zoroastrianism, Manicheism, and Buddhism, really from earliest antiquity. Then between the end of the 2nd and 4th centuries, the first Christians established themselves with especially Nestorian communities who were fleeing the persecutions in the Byzantine and Persian empires. The first Jewish communities established, settled in Central Asia in the 5th century. Then from the 8th century, Islam as a Hanafi school of Sunnism settled in Transoxiana being the region between the Amu Darya and Sir Darya rivers, which includes actually part of what are contemporary Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and parts of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. Nomad populations in Turkmenistan were converted to Islam from the 10th century. Those in the steppes of northern part of what is now Kazakhstan were converted a little bit later from the 14th century. You had also some Shia Ismaili minorities who settled in the Badakhshan region, so in Tajikistan from the 11th century, and who still today count about 200,000 followers. Islam also developed in its Sufi forms. Central Asia has been actually the birthplace of several major Sufi orders, with some regionally prominent Yasaviya, Kubraviya, and Naqshbandiya or Sufi orders. That being said, many earlier religions I mentioned disappeared with the Islamization of Central Asia from the 8th century. For example, the remains of Buddhism and Zoroastrianism are now rare in the region. Also, it's important to understand that shamanism has persisted on the margins of Muslim tradition, especially among Kazakh, Kyrgyz, and Turkmen nomads. And but the religious landscape was changed significantly by Tamerlane and his Timurid successors, who eradicated almost all non-Muslim movements except Judaism. So the next main step of development of religions in Central Asia came with the Russian conquest of the region in the 18th and 19th centuries, which brought a lot of Russian soldiers, a lot of Russian peasants, and also Cossacks, and who brought with them the Russian Orthodox Church and also other Russian churches, like, for example, the Old Believers. And with the Russian conquest came some ethnic minorities of the Russian Empire, including Germans, including Poles, including Ukrainians, who brought to other churches, such as the Catholic Church, but also several Protestant movements, such as the Lutheran Church, but also some Mennonite communities, Baptist communities, Seventh-day Adventist communities came to the region from the 19th century. And besides, Islam continued, of course, its development in the region since the Timurids. And an important point I would like to mention here briefly is that the Russian conquest also gave rise to debates within the ulema, so within the Muslim community from the 1890s between the conservatives named Kadirs, were reluctant to changes, and a new generation of reformers who were called Jadids, who were critical of societies that they judged backward and corrupt. The Jadids were not a unified movement, but they shared a will to look to and implement deep changes in society and brought about debates not only on religion, but also on all social themes related to culture, identity, and politics. Then came the Bolshevik Revolution and the Soviet Union. And in the Soviet logic, religion contradicted the philosophical choices of the regime, of the Soviet regime, which is a society which would be supposedly liberated from the burden of religion as the opium of the people, according to Marx. So what did that mean? Well, this meant for the Soviet regime implementing a strong, first a strong secular policy. And this was materialized, of course, in legislations with, for example, a decree passed in January 1918, which separated religion from the state and from school. And second, the regime initiated anti-religious policies. So in all the territories controlled by the Bolsheviks and then everywhere in the Soviet Union, which was officially established in 1922, the regime launched an anti-religious campaign. Although I would like to specify here that there were differences in the implementation of anti-religion policy from region to region in the Soviet Union. For example, in Central Asia, Moscow was reluctant to come into direct confrontation with Islam right after, the Bolsheviks were, reluctant to come into direct confrontation with Islam right after the revolution. But the Soviet regime gradually undertook in the 1920s some anti-religious campaigns, strong anti-religious campaigns in Central Asia, as elsewhere in the rest of the Soviet Union. And this resulted, for example, in the closure of most mosques in the region. For example, out of 26,000 mosques which were inactivated in the region in 1912, only 1,000 were left in 1941. Besides, about 15,000 primary and secondary religious schools were closed, and a campaign was launched to unveil women. The name of the campaign was Hujum, which reached its peak in 1926, 1927. And all other religious institutions, as well as places of worship of minority religions, so synagogues and churches, suffered the same fate. Where most or many of them were closed. And so the anti-religious policy was combined with a strong atheist propaganda. Then came a period of relative tolerance throughout the Soviet Union with the Second World War. After the entry of the Nazi troops into the Soviet territory on June 21st, 1941, Stalin initiated a period of national reconciliation to support the war effort. So the Soviet regime relaxed restrictions against religion. What does that mean? Well, several measures were taken. For example, spiritual administration of the Muslims of Central Asia and Kazakhstan was created in 1943, which in a way could be interpreted as a kind of Soviet regime's official recognition of the practice of Islam, despite the anti-religious policy carried out since the beginning of the 20s. The Soviet regime also authorized the opening of some madrasas, especially, for example, in Bukhara in 1945, and of a number of mosques elsewhere in Central Asia. But after the war, the last year of Stalin regime, Stalin returned, went back to more fundamental atheist principles of Marxism, and this approach was confirmed by his successor, Nikita Khrushchev, who launched a new anti-religious campaign, which started in 1959, and who set a goal of eliminating religion from Soviet society within 5 years, and it resulted in new waves of repression against all religion, Islam and Christian movements especially. So, and it was not until the Brezhnev regime, so between 1964 and 1982, that the situation of religions in Central Asia stabilized. Official policy, what does that mean? It means that official policy against religion was maintained at the discursive level by the reaffirmation of the principle of state atheism. However, the regime no longer responded to the affirmation of faith by mass terror, but more by pressure of professional discrimination and administrative harassment. So, when it comes to the practice of religion, what did the Soviet regime mean? The official atheism and the control of repression of the Soviet regime did not mean, of course, the end of religious belief and practices in Central Asia and in the rest of the Soviet space. The evolution of religions under the Soviet regime is much more subtle than that, actually. First, clandestine mosques multiply, while, for example, warehouses in kolkhozes or in some other communal spaces like Chaykhana were used as worship spaces. And it's the same with Christian movements. Despite the reduction in the number of churches and of prayer houses, the Orthodox Church, as well as other Christian churches, both Catholic and Protestant, continue to carry out their religious activities discreetly, of course. Although some movements were even able to carry out some proselytizing activities. Second, religious beliefs in Central Asia have consisted of a multitude of practices that escaped official institutions of the Soviet regime. Of course, the Soviet atheism in the Soviet period succeeded in, let's say, suppressing many Islamic institutions that existed before the Soviet regime, for example, the Islamic courts. But it is important, I think, to understand that religion was maintained through practices whose theological significance might have weakened, but which remained signs of a community belonging and identity markers. For example, being a Uzbek or being a Tajik or being a Kazakh meant being a Muslim versus Russian and other Slavic and Christian populations who had settled in the region. And actually, many Central Asians working, or some Central Asians working in the Soviet administration behaved somewhat ambiguously with regard to the Soviet regime's policy on religion by being atheist at their working place during the day, but believers in the evening or weekends with their families. This means that they often turned a blind eye to the maintenance of officially forbidden religious practices. Overall, and especially from the 70s and the 80s, many Central Asians celebrated discreetly, of course, but they celebrated the main Muslim holidays, for example, the beginning of Ramadan, or the fast breaking, or the Feast of the Sacrifice, and some different rites of passage, such as circumcision, or marriage, or a burial. And moreover, from the 1970s, the region experienced an increase in pilgrimages to the shrines of local saints. So while the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, was mostly prohibited, the tombs of local Muslim saints were seen as a place where believers could spend time with friends of God. And this contributed to the development of local approaches of Islam. And also in Central Asia, an important point is that local versions of Islam were also developed by some Sufi groups who practiced depoliticized religious mystic rooted in local traditions. I'm sorry. And so beyond Islam, those Muslim Soviet officials were somewhat insensitive to the atheist ideology, have proved more also tolerant to other religions, including Christianity. Another important point is that Soviet Central Asia saw the arrival of the second largest group of Jews, the Ashkenazi, in two main waves. First, a group in the early 1920s who fled the Russian Civil War and pogroms, as well as famines in Russia and in Ukraine, while a second wave came with the Second World War after the Nazi troops entered Russia in 1941. And Ashkenazi Jews settled mainly in the capitals, for example in Tashkent and in big industrial cities. They were largely Russified, but at the same time they kept their religion and their religious practices. Shia Islam, who had modestly, I explained already, entered the region in the 15th century, also developed during this period with the arrival of some Azeri minorities who settled in Kazakhstan and in Turkmenistan. Who, however, should not be confused with the Ismaili I already talked about, who are a different branch of Shiism. Then Gorbachev's coming to power and the reforms of the Soviet systems that he launched gave a religious expression of freedom that Soviet believers, I would say, never experienced so far during the Soviet regime. And perestroika gave rise to the construction or reopening of many Muslim and Christian places of worship. It allowed the establishment of new religious movements. And so in a short period of time, the growing number of places of worship and the diversity of religious movements contrasted significantly with the religious landscape to which local populations, Central Asian populations, had so far been accustomed. So, To conclude on the Soviet regime, I think an important takeaway is that the closure of buildings of worship and of religious teachings, repression of believing populations, as well as, with rare exceptions, I mean the isolation from the rest of Central Asia, from the rest of the Ummah, all of that did not lead to the almost destruction of Islam as Soviet authorities expected, but rather displaced Islamic values from the public arena to a more private one, to a more private sphere, and significantly contributed to differentiation of Islam as thought and practice in Central Asia from that in other Muslim regions and countries. So with a limited knowledge of Islamic dogma, the believing population in Central Asia practiced a form of localized Islam which became synonymous with tradition and a marker of national identity that differentiated the local Muslim Central Asian population from exogenous Slavic or European recently arrived in the region. So let's move now to the period after independence. So the rapid development of places of worships which were brought during, which happened during the perestroika continued after independence in 1991. Muslims restored or constructed networks of religious buildings for prayer and Islamic educations. And many of these buildings were actually, many of these mosques were built by the political authorities, while more modest mosques were also funded by the local communities of believers. Religious exchanges with other Muslim countries which had been restricted, strongly restricted under the Soviet regime, developed significantly from the very beginning of the 1990s. For example, some Middle Eastern countries like Turkey, Iran, or Arab countries funded several large mosques and made donations for example, religious literature in the region. And of course, minority religions also took advantage of this new political context. The Russian Orthodox Church reopened many or restored many churches throughout the region. The Catholic Church and many Protestant denominations which were present since the 19th century, such as the ones I already mentioned, like Baptist, Seventh-day Adventist, but also new movements or recently arrived Christian movements in the region, like Presbyterian churches, charismatic churches, or Methodist, gained from this religious tolerance after the Soviet regime, and some of them being even supported by missionary movements from Western countries, from the United States, from Europe, or even from South Korea. Several Protestant movements actually engaged relatively rapidly in proselytizing activities, especially among Russians, so among Russian Orthodox, but also among ethnic minorities such as Koreans, and also among the traditionally Muslim populations like Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Turkmen, Kyrgyz, and Tajiks. One thing, however, I would like to specify is that the development of Christianity in the region was slowed down by the massive, by the significant immigration of Slavic and European national minorities. I mean, in less than 2 decades, nearly 4 million Russians, several 100,000 ethnic Ukrainians, Poles, and more than 800,000 Germans left Central Asia to go back to their ethnic homelands in Europe or anywhere else. So, and Judaism experienced a relatively similar fate. After the fall of the Soviet regime, the Jewish population in Central Asia declined rapidly, with the most migrating to Israel or Western countries. And finally, you have some new cults, such as the Baha'i or the Church of Scientology or Hare Krishna, somewhat tried to settle, to enter the region in the beginning of the 1990s. So, but I mean, I'm talking about this strong diversification of religious movements in Central Asia, but I think that beyond this diversification of religious groups, and beyond the proliferation of places of worship in the regions, religious development in Central Asia has been marked by a growth of religiosity. And surveys conducted in the region shows that interest in religion, especially among Muslims, increased significantly everywhere in Central Asia, even in traditionally nomadic culture in Kazakhstan or in Kyrgyzstan. And increased religiosity and religious practice has been particularly marked among the younger generation, who differ significantly. I mean, not all, but many differ significantly from their parents who were educated under the Soviet system and had, I would say, a relatively flexible practice of Islam, for example, praying irregularly or even drinking alcohol. So, and studies conducted in the region since the 2000s shows that a growing percentage of the younger generation is more respectful of the 5 pillars of Islam, demands increased religious educations, refuses to drink alcohol, or follows a halal diet. Excuse me. And so this increased religious interest and practice actually reflects a shift from the feeling of belonging that I already explained prevailed during the Soviet regime, and that still prevails actually under the older generation, meaning that being an Uzbek or being Tajik means being a Muslim. But this feeling of belonging has been paired with an increasing feeling of believing, something which has been extremely well demonstrated in the case of Kyrgyzstan by Julie McBrien. I mean, in a wonderful book that I really strongly recommend to read, entitled From Belonging to Belief, Modern Secularism and Construction of Religion in Kyrgyzstan, which was published in 2017 by the University of Pittsburgh Press. So this means that although in most cases going to the mosque and following the 5 pillars of Islam remains in Central Asia an identity marker, as it was the case under the Soviet regime, this demonstration of ethnic and cultural belonging has been increasingly combined with, and sometimes even exceeded by, a feeling of belief, leading to a quest for true Islam and to a process of personal transformation, both through an individual approach as well as through a group or a mosque. And from this evolutions and intersections results a multitude of possible individual beliefs and daily practices, of course. And this has given rise to debates on how Islam should be approached, how Islam should be practiced. with, for example, debates on the relevancy on what is viewed as local Islam, for example, the cult of local saints that I was mentioning before, which for some believers would contradict what they view finally as a pure Islam. And this development has also given rise sometimes to even intergenerational conflict with young people criticizing their parents and family for not complying with what they view as true Islam. And conversely, some parents sometimes, educated during the Soviet regime, worried about the increasing practice of Islam by their children, some viewing what they consider as, let's say, somewhat excessive or non-traditional religious practice of the new generation and as a potential risk to their own way of life. So, and I'm referring here and quote what great scholar Pauline Jones wrote in the introduction of another excellent book, an edited volume entitled Islam, Society and Politics in Central Asia. So I quote, post-Soviet Central Asia is not simply the re-emergence of beliefs and practices that were pushed underground or confined in the family circle under Soviet rule, but rather their alteration in form, nature, and appearance as individuals and communities gain direct access to ideas and information concerning religion via a variety of new sources, including social media, missionaries, and activists, as well as opportunities to travel and study abroad, end of quote. So, all of this has meant a lot, of course, for the local population, for the Central Asian populations, but also for the political authorities after independence. So the question is, how did Central Asian political authorities try to assert a religious renaissance which they claim happened thanks to their policy and to their support, while at the same time, how did they manage all the questions brought by increasing religious beliefs or questions about identity and religious belief and practices? So, first, each country, of Central Asia, each government of Central Asia has promoted the principle of separation between state and religion. And this is specified in in the constitution of each Central Asian countries. Second, all states of Central Asia guarantee officially freedom of worship and freedom of belief. So individuals are free to practice their own religion or no religion. State atheism has been forbidden, and all individuals are equal officially before the law, whatever their religious belonging. So it's important to understands that no constitution, no state in Central Asia has made Islam the official religion of the country. No constitution, for example, in Central Asia mentions the word Islam or Quran or Muslim. Third, in a region with dozens of ethnic groups, Central Asian governments have tried to promote a principle according to which each religion or religious denomination should reflect the identity of an ethnic group. Consequently, Islam for titular nationalities, for Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Uzbek, Tajiks, and Turkmens, as well as for minorities such as Azeris and Uyghurs, Judaism for Jews, the Russian Christian Orthodoxy, for Russians, Catholicism for Germans, and Protestantism for, Lutheranism for Germans too. And This has meant that most of other movements, especially so-called new religious movements, has been considered as non-traditional movements and have faced increasing pressure. So the main criteria which actually have determined whether a particular religious movement will be defined as non-traditional or even sometimes as a sect are whether it is a newcomer in the country or whether its representatives or its leaders is of foreign origin, or even whether it is attempting sometimes to spread itself via proselytizing activities. So this has led to somewhat paradoxical sometimes situations. For example, some proselytizing denominations such as Baptism and Seventh-day Adventist churches, which are already present and which had been present in the region since the 19th century, have been regularly harassed, accused of being non-traditional religions just because they were conducting proselytizing activities. Also, as I said, they had been present since the Tsarist regimes. And fourth, an essential, of course, element of Central Asian governments' religious policies has consisted of controlling the development of Islam. Why? Because by its potential capacity to innovate political and social spaces, Islam and Islamic movements have been perceived as a potential threat to state authority and legitimacy. So what does that mean? Well, I mean, all Central Asian governments have hoped to dissociate a good or tolerant Islam from a fundamentalist or politicized trends. So they have tried to frame a so-called traditional Islam by encouraging local practices such as the worship of local saints that was already practiced under the Soviet regime, and by encouraging pilgrimages to their tomb, which are deemed apolitical and which that the political authorities view as encouraging believers in their ethnicity and in their national culture. So traditional Islam has been viewed as a religious practice by the governments with exclusively spiritual concerns which reject politicization and promotes national and local religious and cultural traditions. And second, another important point in Central Asian government's policy on religion is that they have used the specter of religious extremism to justify their control over religion. So they have built, I would say, on paternalistic narratives to set themselves up as protectors of their citizens who, after independence, would have spontaneously turned towards religions and consequently could be the targets of fundamentalist or even violent movements. So to do that, Central Asian governments first have presented non-Hanafi Islam as a new phenomenon that would have, according to political authorities, emerged after independence and taken advantage of an alleged ideological void provoked by the collapse of the Soviet Union. And they have assimilated many movements and people proposing alternative approaches of Islam under disparaging and, I would say, overgeneralizing terms such as violent extremists, and presenting them almost systematically as exogenous movements or supported by foreign forces. So this approach raised many questions, and I'm going to discuss now some of them. So first, I mean, despite the strict control of religions by Soviet structures, the doctrines of political Islam developed on their own in Soviet Central Asia within the very heart of the Soviet system. I mean, despite what the political authorities have said, Islamism did not appear only after independence. For many decades in Central Asia has experienced internal theological debates between reformers, conservatives, and fundamentalist trends in Central Asia. And these debates actually did not derive from outside influences, but were much more based, I would say, on local criteria, such as regional traditions, references to influential intellectual figures, the relations of the region to the Soviet state, and even some specific social and economic conditions. And even in the 1920s and 1930s, meaning the worst years of Stalinist repression, the local ulema opposed each other in their interpretation of Islam and continued to train their own disciples. For example, the Sadhum, the spiritual directions that I already mentioned, despite its apparent subservience to official communist discourse, enabled really theological discussion and the ongoing debates among reformer, conservatives, and fundamentalists. And then, again, before the end of the Soviet regime, the political liberalization initiated by Mikhail Gorbachev and the perestroika enabled the proliferation of contacts between Central Asians and other Muslim countries. And second, alternative Islam developed in Central Asia in different forms and came from very different sources. So shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, an array of Islamic funders or entities from Middle Eastern or Gulf countries, such as Iran, Saudi Arabia, or Turkey, came to Central Asia to support the development of Islamic institutions and fund the construction of mosques, of course, to try to exert religious and maybe also a political influence. Contacts among various communities, among various Islamic communities also took place through literature, which was imported by the Sadhum, the spiritual administration, during the Soviet period, and later after independence through other channels. And so another point I would like another point I would like to mention is that the alternative approaches of Islam, including Salafism, has been also propagated through the transnational circulation of people and ideas. For example, after independence, many students, Central Asian students, traveled to Egypt, to Saudi Arabia, or to Pakistan to study Islam, and their return to Central Asia, of course, contributed to some extent to a flow into the region of alternative forms of Islam, including sometimes political Islam, although most of those who returned did not necessarily bring back radical Islamic ideas. Another point is the development of Islamic financing and Sharia-compliant businesses, which developed particularly from the 2000s, and which highlighted the increasing number of entrepreneurs driven by the desire to align their business practices with their religious beliefs. But I mean, it is true that Islamic financing has been increasingly encouraged by political authorities, by Central Asian political authorities, but small entrepreneurs' motivations and interest in Islamic financing may significantly differ from those of Central Asian political authorities, which are driven primarily by, let's say, political or economic benefits. And alternative Islam came also from different structured movements. But from independence, I mean, Central Asian political authorities deliberately ignored the very polycentric nature of movements, proposing in the region some alternative approaches to Islam. I mean, movements which you can, Islamic movements you can find in the region are very different led by their objectives. For example, you have movements which promote a national Islam in reaction to, let's say, the censorship of the state policy, while other movements support an Islam called pure or transnational, or you have some movements which support both approaches. Movements can also be very different by the nature of their activism. For example, some can be political, some can be apolitical, some can be violent, some can be not violent. They can be also very different by their geographical place of their activities, some being active almost exclusively in Central Asia, some being active also outside of on Central Asia, and they can be also different by their evolutionary character. Some movements, for example, which were advocating against the separation of religion and state, eventually accepted that later. So let me mention here let me mention here some examples. First, let me start with maybe the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan, the IRPT, which developed in Tajikistan in response to the government's repressive policies and what the movement viewed as the government's refusal to sufficiently integrate the Muslim component of the local culture into the methods of governance of justice, and also called into question the separation of religion and state. And the IRPT took inspiration from the Jadid movement, seeing it as an indigenous liberalizing tradition interrupted by the Soviet experiment. And it aimed to revive Islam after what is so considered as decades of anti-religious policies, supporting the overlapping of Islam and collective identity. And actually, the IRPT was the only Islamist political party recognized in Central Asia until it was banned in Tajikistan in 2015. A second movement created in 1996, which is IMU, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, which, like the IRPT, reacted to the authoritarian and anti-religious policy of the Uzbek government, as well as to social injustice, but quickly engaged in a violent activism in Uzbekistan and then beyond in Tajikistan, in Kyrgyzstan, and also in Afghanistan. And of course, I mean, foreign Islamic groups have some Islamic groups have come from abroad from the 1990s, and one of the most popular movement in the region is Hizb ut-Tahrir, which was created in Jordan in the 1950s and which advocates the Islamization of power. It supports a pan-Islamist philosophy through the establishment of a caliphate. and but officially through non-violent means. And also, Hizb ut-Tahrir is an international movement. Local groups' activities in Central Asia have been adapted to the local context by developing a national argument combined with a strongly anti-Western and anti-Semitic narrative. And also, despite the unity that the activists themselves aim to display, many people joining movements like Hizb ut-Tahrir appear actually motivated by local social conditions. I mean, most authoritarian states, such as in Karimov's Uzbekistan or in Tajikistan, this membership has been understood as a mode of political opposition, the only one possible actually, and the theological goal of caliphate has been viewed sometimes even irrelevant to the daily concerns of activists. Another movement I want to mention also to exemplify the diversity of alternative Islam in the region is the Tablighi Jamaat, I mean, which originates from the Indian subcontinent and which developed in the region after independence. Also, this movement now has been banned everywhere in Central Asia except in Kyrgyzstan. The Central Asian governments have denounced the Tablighi as extremist, but the Tablighi are actually different from groups like the Hizb ut-Tahrir in their intentional apoliticization. They refuse, to take part in any form of political life. They refuse to take part in any political activities, in any elections. And the states of the former Soviet Union have been, of course, along with states of Western Europe and many countries in the world, they have been targets for recruiters of foreign fighters for the ISIS, and sometimes this is something which has been widely addressed, of course, in local press and everywhere in the world this last year. However, I think it's important to explain here that the scale of this phenomenon, also very real, that's undeniable, has been probably largely overestimated by Central Asian political authorities. Central Asian governments have advanced number of between 5,000 and 10,000 Central Asian recruited by the ISIS until 2017. Most, I would say, more independent sources give a much lower figure, lower than 5,000, and I would recommend to read especially the publications of Noah Tucker, who addressed that very, very seriously, and who gives specific figures for each country and much lower figures. And Central Asians who have joined the ISIS most of them were recruited during their migration to Russia, where their status, I would say, as marginalized migrant workers may have increased their vulnerability as targets. So, all of that is, of course, not what all these examples that I gave, all of that is not, of course, an exhaustive list of alternative approaches to Islam that exist in Central Asia. But I mentioned them first to explain their diversity. And my point here is not to deny that some of those movements or approaches can be dangerous. With some of them obviously supporting violence. And it's of course legitimate for Central Asian governments to control and to prevent the development of radicalization or extremism, as any other governments in the world are trying to do. But Central Asian political authorities' aggregation of most alternative forms of Islam under the label of non-traditional and therefore a threat to local societies, I think has ignored the great diversity of Islam, of approaches to Islam, some of which advocate moderate approaches, respectful of, for example, secular constitutions. So this means that despite the official new approach to Islam and religions claimed by the political authorities after independence, Central Asian governments actually have tried to maintain the Soviet paradox of separation of religion and the state, which actually prevented religions or religious movements from being involved in politics, while at the same time the state maintains strict control over all religious movements and activities. So how did that materialize? Well, this has been done through increasing control of religious institutions and practices, leading to a significant reduction of religious freedom, which was implemented relatively soon after independence from the late 1990s, and despite, again, the claim of religious freedom. So all Central Asian states, to varying extent, have kept or only slightly altered, have kept control, only slightly altered the Soviet control structure and procedures relating to religion, despite the principle, as I said, of separation of state and religion, which is stated in their constitution. For example, the councils for religious affairs, which had been created under the Soviet regime, still exist. Some of them have been renamed, have new names, but their official function is to ease the dialogue between the state and the religious communities, but actually their main function is to keep a strict control over the activities of most religious movements. And same with the Soviet Central Spiritual Administration of Muslims for Central Asia, which was created, as I said, in 1943, which has been kept. Again, now each country of Central Asia has its own Muslim spiritual direction, which can have different names, which is supposed again to ease the dialogue between Muslims and the state, but which is a way to keep a constant control over Muslim life, going, for example, as far in Uzbekistan, the Karimov, or in Turkmenistan still today, as to provide pre-written sermons to imams. Legislation on religion has also become increasingly restrictive, and laws have largely undermined fundamental principles of freedom of conscience, religion or belief, although there are, of course, strong differences among the countries. But still today, for example, mandatory registration of religious groups has been kept in Uzbekistan, in Turkmenistan, in Tajikistan. It has been restored in Kazakhstan, meaning that all religious communities which fail to register under what has been often stringent requirements become illegal and subject to fines, while their leaders and even sometimes their followers can be arrested just because they are considered as practicing illegal religious activities. Religious education, and especially Islamic education, remains a very sensitive issue in all the region, in all Central Asia. It is kept under very strict control in several countries. I mean, the teaching of Islam is limited to a few madrasas. And I would say what is important to understand is that in general, in Central Asia, controls and restrictions have affected Islam even more than other so-called traditional religions. So with the exception of Turkmenistan and to a lesser extent Uzbekistan under late President Karimov, where since the 1990s actually many Christian places of worship were closed, mosques and Muslim places of worship have been particularly targeted. For example, in Uzbekistan, whereas 60,000 mosques were registered in 1993, by 1998, this figure had decreased to less than 2,000 and continued to decrease in the following years. And in Tajikistan, in 2017, the political authorities decided to convert about 2,000 mosques into facilities for general public use. And particular restrictions have been placed on part of the population. For example, in Tajikistan, women are prohibited from attending service in mosque. Same for children. The pilgrimage to Mecca is also subject to very close state control. Particularly over the number and individuals who can participate. For example, in Turkmenistan, where since independence, fewer than 200 people per year have been allowed to visit Saudi Arabia, although the Saudi authorities allow 5,000 Turkmens. And so authorities in all 5 countries have exercised a strict censorship over the publication of religious materials. I mean, local authorities also have on a regular basis used administrative harassment and other pressure such as arbitrary arrest and in some cases also torture of unbelievers who are considered as engaged in unauthorized religious activities. So I would say that all the Central Asian countries are experiencing significant restrictions and fundamental violations of religious rights. But I want also to insist that there are significant differences from one country to another. That's very important. For example, despite restrictions, I mean, Kyrgyzstan has since independence enjoyed, I would say, greater freedom of religion than any other states in the region. Kazakhstan and to an even greater extent Tajikistan have curtailed the relative freedom and religious diversity they had established in the 1990s. And Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan have since the early 1990s significantly restricted religious freedom and human rights in general. Also, I should say that the situation in Uzbekistan has slightly improved with Mirziyoyev. I mean, for example, under Islam Karimov, the government made a list of 17,000 people suspected of being extremists, and many of them were on this list just because for men wearing a beard and or for women wearing a veil, or just because they were going to the mosque very regularly. And Mirziyoyev decided to delete 16,000 out of 17,000 names of this list. So, coming to the conclusion now, I have tried in this lecture to show the diversity of religion, I mean the complexity of their evolution, especially of the majority religion, so of Islam, and also to question some assertions that the local authorities have tried to circulate. So I mean on the so-called freedom of religion that was existing before the Soviet regime, that would have been totally or mostly destroyed by the Soviet regime, and that post-Soviet regimes would have restored. Again, I mean, the concept of renewal has enabled the governments to boast that they have given birth to democracy and allowed their countries to recover their religious freedom and preserved stability, while actually I would say that governments significantly hindered the development of an open dialogue between religion and society, which means that, for example, the enemies of stability of today are actually the enemies of the people of the Soviet times and comprise any elements which who do not unambiguously align themselves with the authorities. So this can be a religious movement, but this can be also political parties, this can be non-governmental organizations, or just intellectually disobedient individuals. So I think one can question the appropriateness of the tactics which are chosen by the political authorities to keep religion in general and official Islam in particular in their ideological clutches. First, the Islamic clergy has been under the strict control of the political authorities and even co-opted by the authorities, and is therefore increasingly perceived as instruments in the authorities' hands, ill-equipped also theologically to resist the narrative of alternative Islamic trends. And second, the official discourse which associates any zealous observance or mystical approach, for example, through Sufism, with terrorist Islamism may contribute to the radicalization of some section of the population. I mean, the ongoing authoritarianism also and the failure of the social contract in Central Asia risks, I mean, fueling politicized Islamic alternative discourse, which does not necessarily mean a violent Islam, as evidenced, for example, by the popularity of the IRPT in Tajikistan, a popularity which actually led the Tajikistani political authorities who felt threatened by this party to ban the party. But even if the social environment in several parts of Central Asia represents an ideal breeding ground for Islamism, another point to understand, and I want to insist on, is that in Central Asia, most of the Central Asian population consider that religion should be separated from state, that religion should be a private matter. I mean, for example, the majority of the population of Central Asia remains favorable to the idea of a secular state respecting the religious rights of everyone. I mean, these figures, of course, might evolve based on some surveys we have seen these last years. You have more and more people who consider that Islam should maybe play a bigger role in society to prevent maybe corruption. So these figures might evolve. It's very difficult to assert, but I will conclude, I mean, that will be my last words. I will conclude by saying that, I mean, Central Asian political authorities will not be able to avoid an essential aspect, which is the diversification of religious practice and the vectors, the diversification of the vectors of transmission of religion, and consequently of the increasing competing sources of religion authorities, regardless of the degree of control desired or proven on the religious phenomenon. And I think I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.